So, we have been on a fast-paced narrative so far in this course. We've covered a lot of time in terms of the story of the Bible. Um, we've covered a lot of history, and this will be begin to be a break in that. Um, this lecture is going to be unique in that it puts somewhat of an end to or a break to the historical narrative. With respect to timeline, we've made it through the universal history, the period of the patriarchs, the wilderness wandering, the conquest, the period of the judges, and now in this module we've been focusing on the period of the kings, the monarchy time in Israel. It's during this period that four major events happen. First, we saw in the previous lecture that the people approached Samuel, the last judge, and they petitioned for a king to be like other nations. After an interesting back and forth between Samuel and the people, as well as Samuel and God, they eventually get their way and Saul is anointed as the first king. Following a somewhat inglorious reign of Saul, David becomes the king. The Old Testament records several of his triumphs and several of his failures. And then after David dies, his son Solomon becomes the king. Solomon is attested to be one of the wisest persons to have ever lived. He's responsible for the building of the temple in Jerusalem. We'll be reading much of his material in future modules. We unfortunately see in 1 Kings chapter 11 that Solomon eventually backslid on his desire to be a godly king and a wise king, and he begins to search for pleasure. He marries hundreds of women and has hundreds of concubines, and he begins to chase after material wealth. And he forsakes, not fully, but in large part forsakes his following of God in the way that he should be following God, and focuses on just worldly desires. Stated that, it's at this point that we have a second major event in the period of the monarchy. So Solomon dies and his son Rehoboam assumes the throne. So the people come to Rehoboam and they say, hey, your dad Solomon was pretty hard on us. So Solomon had brought in conscripted labor. In other words, you have to send your sons to come in and work for a month at a time or a couple months at a time to help build the temple, to help be in the army, these kinds of things. And the people weren't overly happy with this setup. And they come to Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and they say, hey, can you lighten the load? Your dad was pretty tough on us. And Rehoboam, he thinks about it, and he goes to Solomon, his dad Solomon's counselors, and he says, hey, what do you guys think? What should I do here? And the counselors say to him, yeah, your dad really was hard on the people. You should lighten the load. Rehoboam's not completely satisfied with this answer, so he goes to his friends that he grew up with, and he says to them, what do you guys think I should do? And they're like, you need to be harder on these people. You need to show these people who's the boss. And Rehoboam listens to the counsel of his friends and agrees to increase the amount of work that the people are doing for him. Maybe he felt like he had to establish himself as this strong or brutal king just to earn their respect. Anyways, as a response to this, the people rebelled. And it ultimately split the nation of Israel into two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. The details behind the divided monarchy can be found in 2 Kings chapter 11 and 12. And as you're reading Gladding, you'll see that he also does a fantastic job of summarizing this complex history. We see the rise of several kings in these new kingdoms. You have numerous kings that rise and fall. Most of these kings, both in Israel and Judah, when you read the accounts of them, you read, and so became king, and he ruled in Samaria for 7 years, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, even worse than his fathers had done before him. Most of the time, that's what you hear about the evil, and it goes into specifics of the evils that these kings had done. And this was true of most of the kings of Israel. It was also true of most of the kings of Judah. So, for instance, but there are a few good kings that come along as well. Every once in a while, there's a good king to break up the string of bad kings. So one of these kings is seen in 2 Kings chapter 22, a king named Josiah, and we actually continue to see people name their children Josiah because Josiah was such a good and godly king. Um, they're rebuilding the house of the Lord, or the temple, and while they're rebuilding, one of the contractors finds a copy of the book of the law, and Josiah reads it and realizes that the people are not following God at all like they're supposed to be in the covenant. And he repents of this and he helps the nation turn back to God. And it's exciting and it's a great time and it's a good thing. Unfortunately, it didn't last long. Soon after that, there's bad kings again, and they continue to drift away from God. I'll let you read about that and the rest of the narrative of the kings in Gladding's text. But be sure to pay attention here as it contains some vital history that we'll refer to in modules to come. So take note of it. I want to underline things about it in the Gladding text, but it's interesting. So the next two events that are significant in this period of the monarchy include the fall of Israel in 722 BC and the fall of Judah in 586 BC. This was a devastating time for the Hebrew people because their world came completely crashing down around them. You can imagine if the United States was attacked by a neighboring country. So I'm a Canadian, so if we collected all of our snowballs in Canada and came down and attacked you and defeated you, I mean, obviously that's facetious, but you can imagine what it would be like to be conquered by a nation outside that came in and killed off many of the people, and those who survived, many of them were taken into exile. And this is what happened. So the fall of the northern kingdom was brought about by the Assyrians, who were the big baddies of the ancient Near East. So the war campaign was initiated by the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V, and it was completed by Sargon II in 722. When Israel's capital of Samaria fell, they took many of the people that they didn't kill into exile. Judah, on the other hand, managed to fend off the Assyrian invasion. The Assyrians came after them, but they managed to fend them off. But soon after that, 100 years later, as bad king after bad king in the southern nation of Judah continued to ignore God and continued to ignore the warnings of the prophets, the Babylonians rose to power and became a threat. And eventually King Nebuchadnezzar II successfully sieged Jerusalem, and you can read about the siege and how terrible it was in the history books. He destroyed the temple of Yahweh that Solomon had built, and some of the people escaped and fled to Egypt and began to live in Egypt. And for centuries, there was a huge Jewish community down in Egypt. Many of the people were taken into captivity into Babylon. People like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is their story, right? When they were taken into captivity. So the Hebrew people they're taken into exile, and it's often called the Babylonian captivity. Their homes were destroyed. The temple was destroyed. And whoever remained of the people now dwelt in Egypt and in Babylon. As I briefly stated at the beginning of this lecture, we're going to be making somewhat of a shift to how we approach the Old Testament, starting in the next module. Up to this point, we've been rapidly progressing through this historical meta-narrative of Israel, detailing the events that transpired mostly in a historical sense. From here, we're going to slow down a bit and read some of the literature of the people that arose during these trying times. History will still be a part of the discussion, especially as we read the prophets, but we'll be zooming in a bit more on the feel and the emotion and hear the voices of the characters in some of these key events. Our narrative temporarily takes a break in 586 with the Babylonian exile. So when you see that on your timeline, we're stopping the history part for a brief period of time now. This is a time when Israel is in their darkest hour, and we're going to be looking at the literature that arose during that time. One last thing I want to bring to your attention before we close out this lecture is the role of the book of the Chronicles. So there's 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So we don't have time to dive into Chronicles as much as we'd like. Again, we just can't cover everything in this class. But if you get the time to look at it, you'll notice that it retells a lot of the stories from the books of the Kings. Manasseh, for example, appears in 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 1 to 18. He is described as one of the worst kings ever. In this account, he never repents of his evil ways. But in 2 Chronicles chapter 32 and 33, he appears again. It's a second recounting of the same story. So just so you understand, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is it's a second history of this same time period. It's like it's like if you had two textbooks on the United States written from different perspectives. That's kind of what you have with 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings versus 1st and 2nd Chronicles, right? Two different histories being written about the same events, the same time period. So that's important to understand. So when 2nd Chronicles chapters 32 and 33 tell the story of Manasseh, it also points out how much he turned away from Yahweh and what a terrible king he was. However, the ending is different. In 2nd Chronicles, Manasseh repents and turns back to Yahweh. So this is a difference in the retelling of the story. And in these situations, it's good to ask, what theological questions are being asked in these situations by these storytellers? These differences do not exist out of ignorance. They exist to communicate different theological ideas. Feel free to do a wiki search on Manasseh and check out the evidence for him. Then read scripture. Why are all these sources slightly similar and also slightly different? Anyways, it'll be interesting for us to engage in conversation in the discussions this week and to see what you're thinking about all of these different things that we're talking about this week.